Well, hello and welcome to this Coding with the .NET API. This is the 17th lesson within the cycle of 18 that make up our developer series. We're almost at the end. We are covering now really the how to get going with the .NET API. So we'll be looking in today's session about what the API is, how it fits into the architecture of Sage CRM, how it fits in alongside the other APIs, and whether it's a replacement or what its weaknesses are, what its strengths are, and we'll see how we invoke and call the .NET APIs within the context of the user interface. We'll look at the resources that are available to us in order to both learn and use the .NET API, and we'll go through with you now how to create a first project, so a hello world. We'll think about the class that we've been using for the creation of the pages, and we'll set things up so that next week we'll finish off by looking at the specialized classes and some of the more sophisticated interactions that we're able to do with the .NET API. So where do we start? Well, we start where we always start, by saying go to help.sagecrm.com. There you'll find all of the information around the supported versions of Sage CRM, the link to the developer resources as well, and putting everything into the context of the release cycle and all of the implementations that we can do. So let's assume that we go into the Help Center. You'll find within the version that you're working with a link to the developer help. The developer help points you off, though, to the if you're interested in the .NET API, it will actually point you off away from the Help Center off to the developer portal. One of the things that we're very pleased about within the Sage CRM family of APIs is how well they've been able to be adopted and moved over to developer.sage.com. So alongside the REST API and the .NET API and also the client-side API, this is where you will find all of the documentation for using the .NET API. So that's in developer.sage.com. If you are working with this, you can see that this is where you will be able to get started with the .NET API and the SDK, and the documentation explains where you're going to be able to get hold of the SDK and how you start building your first .NET project. I would encourage you to make sure that these are all bookmarked, that you know where to find these, and you'll be able to read these at your leisure. But moving on and thinking about where you physically get hold of the SDK installer, this is in the community.sagecrm.com. Now, this will be changing in the course of 2024. It will be moved over into the Sage Community Hub rather than community.sagecrm.com. But for now, you will find the SDK installer here, and once you have located it within inside the community, you can download it. And the latest version is for the release for 2023 R2. It's important to make sure you're working with the right supported version of the SDK installer, largely because it's to do with the recognition of seeing whether or not it identifies and can install by you having a particular version of Sage CRM on the machine. You'll also see a whole host of resources up on the blog, the Sage Hints, Tips and Tricks blogs, where we've got lots of articles on how the different classes are used and how different techniques can be done with the .NET API. So that's in the main Sage CRM blog. We've got development examples there, and of course you've got the discussion forum to be able to expand on how to achieve something with the .NET API. There's also a whole set of videos which now exist up on YouTube about how to do things with the .NET API. Mostly these are fairly introductory, but you can it will have slightly different information within the context of what is being done. A little bit more live demo of the software as well as you're writing. Let's though start with the architecture of Sage CRM. If we think about Sage CRM, we know that Sage CRM is a browser-based application. Any of the screens that we're seeing within CRM are as a result of an HTTP request that the web server has responded to with HTML that has been returned and is then interpreted within the browser. The server that is the main server is an IIS API extension, which is then communicating with the database, building an interface based on metadata definitions held within the system database, combined with the application data, which together produces the screen, which is then returned to the user. And we've seen that the mechanism that we've used with the ASP pages, actually, even though we're writing an ASP page, we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting by using the definitions that are contained within inside the system database, the metadata. So it's a metadata-driven application. And what's true for the ASP pages is true for the .NET application extensions as well. Whereas the ASP pages are seen as part of the side of the application, which is the COM-based application. So it's working with the main IS API DLL, the eWare DLL, rather than with the Java-based technologies. That's the same actually for the .NET extensions as well, because the .NET application extensions are going to be communicating ultimately through through COM interop, being able to access the core behavior of the eWare DLL. The eWare DLL is then going to be responsible for managing the session. It's going to be managing the overall user interface generation, including aspects about security and territory management, the interaction with the database, and the return of the metadata definitions, which will then cause the screens to be rendered. Because all of this takes place in the context of the HTTP request and response that is directed at the eWare DLL, and within that, and by that, the extension that we have written, which will be a .NET DLL, that management of the HTTP response or request response cycle means that we're not going to be able to use any of the other visual mechanisms. It's not designed for use, say, in the ASP.NET type world. We're assuming that you're writing an extension for the Sage CRM interface, where the Sage CRM interface is generated within the capabilities of the eWare DLL. So you're not going to be using it in ASP.NET, which the forms, the structures are then managed by other namespaces and classes linked to within the project. We'll actually start to see that as we come into the definitions of things. But any of our .NET pages are able to access the full range of the CRM metadata and the metadata definitions. And there are specialized classes to be able to render out a list, a screen, to implicitly handle the idea of the fetch of the data and the pagination of the data according to the preferences of a user. So you've got all of the things that you would expect within the ASP environment within the .NET development environment. So it's using the same, very similar paradigm as to how these classes work, but we're writing obviously in a different way rather than in JavaScript within inside an ASP page. So the .NET API, it is now a mature, very mature API. So it's been around for years. It's used within the product and it's continued to be used within the product to develop features. You'll see that in a moment. So it's very stable, it's very mature. There aren't many known issues associated with the .NET API. And its point here is to extend the choice that developers have to work in an environment that they want to. So a modern integrated development environment to be able to handle everything from breakpoints and debugging that you want to be able to do. So it expands the range of tools which allows integrations to be developed. It is just one of the choices that we have for extending Sage CRM. So you can see here that the .NET API has to be considered as part of the range of options that we have for developing the interface. It's very similar in its scope and behavior to the classic COM API. And because it is tied to the idea of the interface, you're not going to be using it for in the context of, say, in the same way that you would use a REST API or a SOAP API with disconnected systems. So it is assuming that you're developing an extension to the main CRM interface rather than something that is outside and separate to it, communicating to it. We don't imagine that the .NET API is a replacement for the COM ASP API. The joy of being able to work with the ASP pages is that you can just rattle in code, you can edit it very, very quickly. It's a quick and dirty way of being able to work, really. It shouldn't be. But the joy is that many partners like the scripting environment of the COM ASP pages, because you can just make a very simple page change within the COM environment here, especially when you are making a change of a customization for a customer. It is something that isn't going to allow anyone to fiddle with without actually going back to the source code to making a change. So there is an implied development structure which makes it much more suitable for environments where you want to be able to stop casual changes to a particular customization or feature. So we do get a compiled end product that is not human readable. There is some, therefore, limited protection for intellectual property. You can do a little bit more to obfuscate the code inside the DLL. But the chief advantage is that you just can't tweak a line, so you have a very much more predictable release cycle to be able to deliver things. And one of the nice things, though, about it as well is that the similarity with the ASP environment is that you can, if you had a DLL, you can just do a hot drop and you can put in a new DLL, and that new DLL would then be used from that point on. So there's not a, if you're redistributing a new version of a DLL through a component, and the command manager can be used for that purpose, it's easy to be able to exchange and share the files. You can code in whatever language you like, although all of the examples that we provide are in C#, so perhaps that's probably a hint that writing in C# is the best way of getting any support, but theoretically you can write in whatever .NET supported language you want to. Works on the basis that what we are relying on is this .NET model from Microsoft, where we write in C#. We're using a C# compiler to be able to then generate from our source code some intermediate code, or Microsoft intermediate language, which is the form in which we will have generated our application extension, the DLL that is sent across to the system. And then within the context of the common language runtime within the operating system, that is then turned into the native code needed to be able to run as a DLL. That's the runtime environment that we have. So what we end up doing is delivering DLLs into CRM. They will be, as we will see in a little bit, they will be linked to, they will sit in a location similar to the idea of the custom pages location that we saw with the ASP pages. So there will be a folder where all our .NET DLL projects sit. The DLLs are linked to within the interface in a very similar way to the ASP pages. And as they are invoked as a resource that we're passing the processing of the page to that resource. But the inside here is that there is a interaction where the DLL that we have causes COM interop to trigger. So we're relying on there being some helper applications, helper DLLs installed that are then used to be able to send and redirect the calls to the DLL into the internal libraries within the eWare DLL, so that we can use the behavior there. So there is an interop so that when we're calling a specialized class, which is calling a list block, it's essentially calling the list block inside the eWare DLL in order to generate the list page that we want to see. And that would extend to any of the classes that we find ourselves using for when we want to be able to access a translation, or we want to be able to commit a change into the database. It's used in the product, so it's used for the relationships page inside Sage CRM. Here you can see I've come into the context of the company and I'm looking at the relationships tab. That page is calling and invoking a DLL. You can see that within the URL of the page, and all of the functionality is used. It's important to understand that Sage CRM is committed to this API because we're using it ourselves, and we've used it recently when we added in the feature for the company narrative. So this has a whole set of statements and code in here to render the company narrative page, doing a bit of interpretation, essentially based on a form of procedural AI. So it's doing a fair amount of chunking there in that way. Now, we're also used, the .NET API is also used by Sage colleagues who are working on the integration. So if we look at, say, the Sage 300 integration, the rendering out of the 300 web screens takes place in the context of it's rendered using an iframe, but it's rendered and managed in the context of a .NET project. And so the .NET project is handling whatever parameters that you want to pass to it, which will invoke whatever screens that are wanted to be displayed. So it's used throughout the product, and we're therefore committed to the .NET API. .NET extensions are invoked in a very similar way from the ASP pages can be called. So they're called from our tabs and menus. We have a specific action that we'll see that when we come on to creating our first project here that we use, which is custom.NET DLL. It relies on the idea that we have not only the need to make sure that we're referencing the .NET DLL, but we're also then referencing the publicly exposed method that will invoke the behavior that we've programmed and that we're interested in. We can use the DLLs in the same place where we have any other hyperlink. So we can define them associated with the hyperlinks on lists, jumping across there. We can pass in across the variables that we need in the context of a jump as well. So providing the primary key information that we want then to use in order to retrieve data. We can add buttons onto screens. Those buttons can be inside ASP pages. They can be inside other .NET DLLs. They can even be constructed using the client-side API to be able to dynamically construct things. So there's lots of ways in which we can invoke the DLLs and link them to the interface. And you can also, as it says that last line, which is also something I forget, which is when you're processing and running a DLL, if necessary, you can split off and redirect the functioning and processing of that DLL into another DLL. So you have the possibility there of using a dispatch class to be able to refer or redirect the processing to another DLL if appropriate. So let's have a look at getting going with the first project. We have to think about the resources that are available to us and going through and downloading the SDK installer and making sure that we've got the SDK that we can play with. So if you are going to download the SDK installer, and that's going to be up on the community, that you search for the SDK installer and look for the 2023 one, we need to make sure that we've got on the production environment, we will need to have Sage CRM installed. We will need to have the .NET Framework 2 in place. It's using that framework model. That's a old, I feel like saying it's older code, but it still checks out. It's subsumed into the later .NET frameworks, so it is incorporated there. I've never run into a recent incident where somebody doesn't have that, because it's all part of the framework. When we've got though our SDK installer, we need to make sure that on the target server or on the target machine where we want to install the SDK, we actually have to have Sage CRM installed, because it's going to look for that, because it needs to be able to copy certain files across and then register them within the global accessibility global cache. I can't remember what the GAC stands for, but it will. You need to also have Visual Studio. I across the laptops that I use, I managed to have versions ranging from 22 Visual Studio 22 through to Visual Studio 2017. Although I think we're saying it's 19 and 22 that are currently supported on the notes, I know that it's also working quite happily with older versions of Visual Studio as well. So the installation goes like this. Once we've downloaded the zip file and unpacked that, we can run the installer and confirm that we're happy with the license agreement. It then does a very simple job, which is simply to unpack a whole set of resources and copy them into copy those into the Visual Studio folders. These are some projects, snippet files, sample projects as well that are delivered. And that's it. So you get 4 screens and a little bit of wait time, and then the SDK is installed. It's then just a question of going directly in to starting to create our first project. Now, please note that within this, you've got, as I said, a whole set of different resources within the SDK, including these templates that I'll talk about in a moment, which allow for projects to get going, snippets for once you're starting to code, and then sample projects for you then to look at. I want to put everything into context of how the .NET API fits in with other things that we'll be doing. We will see how the .NET API works alongside the Advanced Customization Wizard next week. But you will get a whole set of resources available to you. As I said, the SDK snippet files, you'll see those. I'll be demonstrating those in the course of the next lesson, because we have to do certain things in certain order, and it just makes sense to be able to, as we are changing projects and being a little bit more advanced in the next lesson, you'll see how those work. But they work essentially just like any other snippets, and there are blog articles if you want to have a look and see how they're used as well before then. I said one of the resources that are delivered in are these helper DLLs, which are the providing the COM interop and the wrapping of how we would then interface with that within our own projects. And these have to be then registered within the global assembly cache, and you'll find those referenced inside our own our own pages. So you can see these are the locations that they're added, and then they are referenced inside the .NET projects. Please note, by the way, when you're looking for files associated with the .NET API, rather than your own individual projects, you will find them underneath program files, Sage CRM, and then at the level of where we would go down into our own installs, our own instances of the project, it will be at that level. So it's a sibling folder, or on the same level as the install of Sage CRM we perform. So it's held at a higher level. So how do we get going with the project? Well, we have to open up our Visual Studio, and the experience of starting the project will differ depending on your version of Visual Studio. So I've managed to find different screens depending on whether I'm using a community edition of Visual Studio or I am using a 2017, 2019 or 2022. So it's different. You'll get a slightly different way of starting this, but what you're looking for are 2 templates within the C# environment, which is one is the basic template and the other is the entity template. And the basic template allows us to get going with the creation of with our first project. That's what I am going to be using now. So here, once you start a project and you choose, click, I want to run this, you will be invited to name your project and it's saved and opened. So you might be putting it down into repos and running where your project definition is. That's where my things are saved. I've called my project here Dev Training Basic. So I can look at Dev Training Entity in next week, and you can see that the code that has automatically been generated has created two classes. One is custompage.cs and the other is base.cs. I'm looking at the moment at custompage.cs, and you can see that this is the raw hello world test that you can use. And it's the advantage that this is just a hello world page, and it's showing us what namespace references that we're using. So there are system ones that we're using, and there is then specifically this idea of the CRM web object, and it's the CRM web object which is going to give us the ability to be part of the HTTP request response cycle of an extension of the Sage CRM user interface. So we have different namespaces, they're doing different things. Sage CRM.blocks, they're handling the elements of the large scale screen elements like lists and the screens themselves and tabs. Then you have controls, and these are the final level controls that you'll see. You'll have data, which is literally what it says on the tin. So it is the ability to handle interactions, looking at the record object or the entity equivalent, being able to handle the insert, update and delete tasks, errors, look after errors, graphics, look after the charting abilities that we have, and then HTML allows us to assemble different structures of HTML in order to send out to the page. User interface is another element which allows us to control things like panels and structures inside the layout of the interface, and utilities does everything from looking at system preferences to translations. As I said, the web object is responsible here for the management of the request response cycle and the generation of the interface. So our basic setting, if I've started my basic project, I will have, as I said, custom pages and basic available to me. Within that, we'll have the different classes with the different classes we're defining that will then be used by the project. We need to check that our project references are correct, but let's assume that certainly if you're just a vanilla system and running with this, it'll happen very neatly. We need to be mindful of where our DLLs need to be placed if we want to be able to incorporate them into the interface. Here you can see the path. So whereas, and this is a thing to be mindful of, here you can see I have come down into program files, Sage, into CRM, then into the instance of CRM, and then into custom.net. There is another custom.net folder at the above that, but that is at the level in which the COM interop DLLs like the Sage CRM.net and the Sage CRM.net wrapper.dlls are placed, which are across all instances of CRM that might be installed on that server for development purposes. Bear in mind, in a production environment, we only support one instance of Sage CRM on a production server. So this is where we would expect our files to be written out to. That's where I need to be mindful, because what I want to do in order to quickly prove to you everything is working, what I want to do is to then change my output path for my visual development environment, so that the DLL that it renders isn't going to go into the bin/debug folder by default. It's going to go instead into this target custom.net folder where Sage CRM expects it to be. So that's going to change where, when I build, it writes the DLL, and I need to know that my basic or base CS file class contains here a method that is going to be exposed and allow us to link the interface to the DLL. So the base class contains the method used to call the DLL's behavior from the Sage CRM interface. And here you can see that that's called run my custom page. So the DLL can be built, linked and tested. Because we've changed, or I changed its build location, it's going to write out where I need to. I can, as you can see on the screen, I've changed my company tab group to reference that dev training. So I've got the name of my custom, the action is the customs.net DLL as the action, and then my path to the DLL is the name of dev training basic, and then I've got my run my custom page method being listed there. If I do that and I return into CRM, this is what it produces. So this is the basic hello world exercise that the basic template creates for me. So I just run that, and here you can see it's doing a very simple test. One of the things you don't necessarily notice is that it's actually put this into the context of the existing tab group. So it's got a tab group shown here. We can also see that it's labeling it with some basic text, my custom page. It's got the hello world message being written out, but it's also been able to go away and get hold of some system information with getting hold of the base currency for the system. So this is a test to prove that everything that should be working in terms of the DLL's ability to connect, to be able to render out an interface, and to be able to access the system database for metadata and system application data and return those to the screen is working. So this is a basic thing you want to be able to do. Use the basic template in order to say hello world. The next stage to that is to start to examine what's going on. I'll start from the public side and work back into the code that generated the hello world. So our starting point is the base, because the base is the thing that handles this link to the and ties it into the HTTP request response. That's the class for the web object is responsible for managing that cycle. So we have to, in order to get ready to be able to have a method that can be invoked from the CRM interface, we have to have a public static class called AppFactory. That's going to then call the other methods, which in turn can reference other methods. So here I've got my app factory class, which is invoking run my custom page, which in turn within that has got the my custom page class. So the my custom page class is the thing that is doing the hello world. The run my custom page is there, the wrapper within the context of the app factory. Okay, so that's basically that's the structure that we need for that. And then it's the question of the simple web class that we're doing. You'll see that this simple web class works on the basis, and these are in the same namespace. So these are in the same namespace, so everything can see each other. And this class is of type my custom page is a web class which has within it a fundamental method. Now we've used the idea of the fundamental method before, which is when we were working with the COM objects, we talked about the idea of the execute method being the fundamental method that went and did the thing that class was designed to do, that little object was designed to do. Here, our class is designed to do a whole set of behaviors, but we can override them. And at the moment, if we were to just call this class, it wouldn't do anything other than just create a blank page. But if we put within it a public override void build contents, the build contents method is now being overridden to whatever we want to put in as the contents. And you can see that we're able to do a host of little tasks, everything from controlling what tab group is displayed, what messages are written out onto the screen, what data is fetched or what metadata is fetched in order to create the screen. So that's the simple method that we see in this hello world exercise. Very simple that we can do. Marquee, I don't know why I've got marquee in there. That's a bit foolish. Marquee is very deprecated HTML, just sending a message across the screen. But here you can see things that are relatively familiar to us, the idea of getting the tabs, getting the content, add content, even the idea of being able to start to write messages out onto the screen. If we write an error message out onto the screen, for example, and use the add error, it will know that it has to go out onto the screen in a particular place. If we add a button onto the screen, it knows that button contents go to a particular place on the screen. Headers go to a particular place on the screen. The API, these methods that we're invoking have an understanding that not only in terms of creating the HTML, but creating the HTML in the context of the overall structure of the page that we're writing. You can see this starting to be here. Let's understand that we can also do things like the add an error onto the page, and we can do logging onto the page. Well, here, if I've added an error onto the page, it writes it out where error messages should go. So even if I've put this low down in the code, it goes at the top. The display goes at the top because it knows that that's where the product of an error message is. So it isn't just a question of write a message in pink or salmon or whatever you want to call that color. It's writing it out into a particular name, into a particular structural location where all error messages are supposed to go. So there, it makes for the control of the screen much easier for us to be able to do that. And we can be even more sophisticated in terms of how we want to respond, because our DLL page that is generated, although it's not perfectly matching the environment of the system pages, nevertheless, it will automatically incorporate the libraries that are used for the client-side API as well. So we end up with being able to know that we can use the writer DLL that also has the ability to do client-side processing as well. So we could have our page doing AJAX calls. We could have our page using the libraries to allow us to control what's going on in the fields, and therefore that we have displayed, or the information that we have displayed on the screen. Here you can see that I've got a little bit of code that will use the CRM ready behavior, so that when the page is loaded, it will write an information message onto the page. And that's been added into the header. So it shows you where you can put JavaScript into the page. So, and it's talking about the idea it has access to all of the custom libraries that you want to use as well. So how does this work? Well, here you can see that I've put in to my page the code. So this is the code that I was writing today. CRM ready function, calling out the information message just to prove that this is taking place client side. And there we can see that it writes it out, and again it knows where to write this out because it's got a combination of the structure of the page is correct. It would know where to put buttons. If we wanted to put buttons, it would know where to put an error message or a tab or whatever we want to put in, because that type of structure has a particular place. So there are other messages, there are other methods that we're looking at, there are other things that we're using, talking about the different namespaces that we have. We're able to get hold of metadata, we're able to get hold of get screen, get list, get translation. We're able to get hold of information through the utils namespace for the current user. We're able to start assembling HTML strings that we want to do. We want to do all these different things, including the handling of committing transactions or redirecting or working with locks or whatever we want to be able to do. All of this can be included within inside the page, and here you can see we're making use of these namespace elements, these namespace and their and the functions contained within them to be able to do that. So metadata.get translation, metadata.get param, we're able to be able to hunt the information that we're interested in from the metadata. Okay. Our pages can also be really extended so that we can now have all of the user interface instructions that we need. So we can add in coaching captions into the screen, very simple to be able to do. So it behaves just as if it's a system page. This is why it's nice to be able to use these for integrations, so it's as though you're not leaving CRM, it behaves completely. Here, this is a standard feature where you can go into Sage CRM, choose to use inline coaching captions editing. You can then go off to the new screen that you've created. Here you can see that it is my page that I've evolved, and you'll notice where it says add edit coaching text. So if I click that, I'll get a pop-up. I can put some text of my own in here that when I save it, it will appear as a coaching caption. Coming back into the product That's the instruction that we see, and it can be minimized or removed by a user in the same way that coaching captions anywhere else within inside the product can be used. Now, this is just a beginning. This is really all that we can do in a session like this, is to start that process of explaining the power of the .NET API. We'll be developing this still a little bit further next week. What I want you to do, though, is always in your mind, remember that we provide everything that I've covered today and more. You can start to see for yourself how the .NET API is used, because we've provided some sample applications. So we've got the company summary example, a partial rebuild of a company summary. We've got a compound entry screen as well. We've got a rebuild of the quick look page to see how that works. And we've also provided a version of the related entities code that we incorporate within our own product, so that there is a option for you to look at that and then say, well, tell you what, I want to be able to take that further, or use the ideas in there to explain how things are done. That's including sort of how to add checklists into list blocks, how to be able to have different colored labels, and all that is contained within inside the different example applications shown here. Next week, we are going to finish off our discussion of the .NET API and finish off the entire series. We're going to be looking at the specialized classes of the .NET API, as well as looking at some of the other practical elements that we haven't had time to do in today's session. But let's see if anyone has got any questions. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, goodbye and happy coding. Bye-bye.